Aloha mai kako, and welcome to this session of Brown Bag Biography, the longest running seminar series at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. It was started in the mid-1980s by George Simpson, the emeritus director of the center and the founder of the center, and has been ably run and organized by Zoe Sprout, who's the graduate assistant at the Center for Biographical Research, and Paige Rasmussen, who is our managing editor and general manager for the center. So I would like to thank all three of them currently and posthumously. Today's session is Brown Bag number 770, so it has been going on for quite a while. Before I introduce our speaker today, what I would like to do is just provide some information about future talks and also to outline a few of the guidelines as to how we're going to be operating today. The first thing, I'm sorry to have to pass this along, but the scheduled talk by Kalani Opua Young next week, because of unexpected family matters, is not going to be able to be held. So we are going to have to cancel next week's session of Brown Bag Biography. We will, of course, schedule that down the road, and we'll be very interested in hearing her presentation. The week after that is quite intriguing. This is tied very much into the Value of Hawaii 3 Hulihia, The Turning, the latest installment in the Value of Hawaii series. This collection of brief essays has 65 to 70 contributors, all responding to the last year of crisis in Hawaii and speculating and dreaming about what the future could look like in the face of these profound changes. That work has been recently published by University of Hawaii Press, and you can get a copy of it. The physical copy actually exists, and it's right here now for $24.95 from the University of Hawaii Press. But from the very beginning, because we wanted this as a collection to spur discussion and to be used as a teaching tool or whatever, it is also available as a free download all the time. We are at the point now where I think we've had over 9,000 views just in the last 3 to 4 months. And Zoe will put in the chat the link there if you would like to get a free copy or you would like information about how to buy one. The reason I'm mentioning this is because one of the contributors to that is Lisa Grandanetti, and we're going to be having a session 2 weeks from today, February 25th, 2021, which is called Grandanetti Goyle's Guide to Surviving the Apocalypse. Lisa Grandanetti and Tina Grandanetti are sisters, and both of them heavily involved in Hawaii activism. Lisa is actually working at the moment in the office of Representative Amy Russo. Tina is, I believe, completing a doctoral dissertation in sort of urban design with RMIT, which is a major university in Melbourne, Australia. They're going to be talking basically about the business of bringing activism together with education and to their profession, but also how that has been affected by the fact that they've been very, very active sisters doing this for quite a period of time. So I invite you to be here for that. If you would like to find out more about the general events that we have, you can join the Center for Biographical Writers Research mailing list. Zoe will put that link into the chat as well too. And there's also the opportunity to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram for updates. Now, one bit of business in terms of this session, for various issues of security, the way we will be working the question and answer is that it'll be run through the chat function. So when we get to the point where you'll be able to ask questions or offer comments on the presentation of our speaker, if you would put those questions in the chat box, and we will do the Q&A at the end, and I will direct your questions directly to the speaker, who will then answer those. We should mention, this is part of this, that I will be saying your name to indicate that the question is coming from you. So you should know that this session will eventually be recorded and posted on YouTube. So if you do ask a question, your name will be on that recording. So just be aware of that before you ask the question. I know this seems to be rather almost over careful or particular, but we're all working in what is still a relatively new environment, and we want to make sure that people's right to privacy is protected. Okay, and now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Gail Okawa, the author of Remembering Our Grandfathers Exile, From Biography to Communal Biography on Hawaii's Issei Internment. Part of that is the title of the book. The other part is the title of the talk today. Gail is interested in the links between language, literacy, culture, and race in relation to history, social justice, and education. Since 2002, when she was a visiting scholar at the Smithsonian Institution, she has been exploring the experiences of Japanese immigrants from Hawaii, including her maternal grandfather, who, with these other immigrants, were some of which were imprisoned during World War II in internment camps on the US mainland. Her project extended to include the visits of sons in Nisei military units to their intern fathers and stories of the internees' sons who were killed in action, as well as to record memories of the Santa Fe Internment Camp among the city's present-day residents. Now, Remembering Our Grandfathers Exile, the book, is a composite chronicling of the Hawaii Japanese immigrant experience in mainland exile and internment during World War II, from the pre-war climate to arrest to exile to return. Gail is going to fill us in on quite a bit in terms of how this was actually carried out. What I would like to point out, though, is the level of life writing and the range and variety of these materials is very important. She interweaves documents, personal and official, internees' firsthand accounts, letters, and poetry to create a narrative that not only conveys their experience, but equally important, exemplifies their literacy as ironic and deliberate acts of resistance to oppressive conditions. The book is now out, which we are very, very happy about. It has been published by UH Press. And to quote Gary Okahiro, he describes the book as basically this. Meticulous in his documentation, Watanabe Tamasaku left photographs and a carefully bundled collection of letters from Santa Fe detention station to his daughter, Sumi, mother of the author of this remarkable and moving history, Remembering Our Grandfathers' Exile. This memory narrative, a personal journey of coming into consciousness, is filled with names and lives of integrity and dignity, comprising a community of remembrance and commemoration. I have just two final points to make here. First, Gail and this book both have special significance for the Center for Biographical Research. She has been a visiting fellow with the center for many years. We've had the opportunity to provide her with various kinds of support for her work. And in return, we've been able to benefit from her doing previous brown bags, keeping us aware of how this very long and complicated and rewarding process has unfolded over the years. And so we celebrate the fact that the book is here, and I would guess many of the people who are watching this today are equally happy and proud to have had something to do with this book finally appearing. The second thing I wanted to mention, which I indicated to Gail years ago, is that none of us could have anticipated COVID. But if on the other side of this, we are able to move once more to face-to-face in the same room, I'm putting on record that the center is fully committed to being involved and organizing a very full launch for this book so that we can all gather together and celebrate its appearance. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Gail Okawa.
Thank you, Craig. I am trying to figure out now what needs to be done I think I just hit a share screen. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, it's not working. Here we go. Okay. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the center, especially Craig, John Zern, and Stan Schaub before his retirement. And now Paige Rasmussen and Zoe Sprott for inviting me to serve as a visiting scholar fellow during my sabbatical 18 years ago, and then giving me an academic home and support for my work over the years, as Craig mentioned. I'd also like to warn you all out there that this is my first attempt at a Zoom presentation, so please forgive any technical glitches if there are any. Some of you may be familiar with the research that has been recorded in this recently published book, Remembering Our Grandfathers Exile. As Craig had said, I've given a few brown bag talks on it since 2003, but I thought I'd share something of my research journey today, how a biography project expanded to a collective communal biography project, how personal and socio-political circumstances out there have shaped it over almost 2 decades. The origins of this journey are in my adolescence. Sometime in the 1950s, when I was learning about the World War II imprisonment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast and mentioned it to a neighbor, I learned then that this grandfather, my mother's father, had been interned in a concentration camp during World War II. When I questioned my parents, they acknowledged that he had been imprisoned and returned a changed man, but they didn't elaborate. 40 years later, in the 1990s and years after his death, while going through my grandfather's possessions carefully stored in an old trunk, I found this lone photo among letters and documents that seemed related to his internment, so I knew that the photo was related to it. My mother recognized her father in the 3rd row. But it wasn't until fall 2001 that I developed a sabbatical project on my grandfather's World War II internment with the encouragement of my department colleagues, at least one of whom I hope is on this Zoom call. Being conceived and developed coincidentally at the same time of 9/11, another external attack on the US. This became a lifetime project that has culminated in a book finally being published in a worldwide pandemic with domestic attacks on American democracy. So it started as a biography on Reverend Watanabe. Sorry, I'm having a little difficulty. It started as a biography on Reverend Watanabe, it was text-based with a singular focus. He had immigrated at age 22 from Hiroshima, Japan to San Francisco in 1905, was baptized as a Christian in San Francisco, and after the Great San Francisco earthquake, was inspired to study the Christian ministry. Here he is, middle of the group. He married and started a family in California, but was recruited by Reverend Takie Okamura to serve in the Hawaiian Islands as an evangelist, where he was first assigned to Maui. Here he is at the very top row of his flock. Then to Ola on the Big Island. So my research journey took me first to the Big Island, where he had been arrested at his parsonage on December 7th. But I found nothing there. Only a stone wall and an empty parking lot. The church itself had been, I'm not sure if it was condemned, but it was termite eaten. And so it had been moved and a new church had been built in another location. But I had hopes of finding something in New Mexico because of this photo and letters from, New Mexico addresses that my mother had shared earlier. Days in the State Library and Archives produced unrelated World War II materials, like this letter, referring to all Japs as skunks, and one reference to Reverend Watanabe on a list. But no one could even tell me where the camp was. I did meet some key people, though. A retired Air Force Colonel, Joe Ando, who was the son of an internee, and a co-chair, and the co-chair of a committee seeking to establish a historical marker for the Santa Fe Internment Camp. I met him along with the director of the New Mexico History Museum, who was the other co-chair. So I learned from them that the site was now a subdivision. They invited me to the dedication of what I learned was a highly controversial historical marker a couple of weeks later on April 20th, 2002. Several hundred people from Alaska, Hawaii, and the mainland attended this event, and this had a profound effect on me. As I described in some detail, I'd like to read just the last paragraph of that description. I was moved by the attendance of internee families from all over the country and the social, political, and spiritual significance of the event. At the luncheon reception following the dedication, Colonel Ando asked me to speak to the crowd, and I surprised myself by overcoming my shyness and addressing the large audience as an intimate one, bound by the common inheritance of internment and among non-Japanese Americans, the desire not to forget. The attentiveness of this audience brought the gravity of my project home to me. I began to realize my place and the place of my research in relation to the Japanese American community and the American public at large. But when I returned to Washington, D.C., where I was a scholar in residence at the Smithsonian, I was still focused on Reverend Watanabe. Months in the National Archives produced 5 files on him. And you can see them here, the Immigration and Naturalization Service file, one from the Office of the Military Government of the Territory of Hawaii, one from the Department of Justice, and 2 from the Office of the Provost Marshal General. This is an example of one of the files from the Department of Justice. And a memo from J. Edgar Hoover, dated May 1941, where he says it is recommended that this individual be considered for custodial detention in the event of a national emergency. The information contained on the attached dossier constitutes the basis for appropriate consideration in this regard. However, the only document predating his memo was this one. The so-called evidence describes Reverend Watanabe as a consular agent, which was an appointed voluntary position, not a paid position. And it describes his job as bureaucratic, but states, and this is the very important passage, states that consular agents, quote, are believed to act as espionage agents or observers, unquote. Now, that supposition or assumption is repeated, and as we have seen, lies can become truth with repetition. So this was the warrant of his arrest. Again, an interesting document in that it says, you are hereby commanded to take the body of Tamasaku Watanabe on suspicion of being an alien enemy of the United States. Now, anti-Japanese immigration laws, I learned, made alien enemy, the term alien enemy, merely an immigration status. The Alien Enemies Act of 1918, which was based on the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, changed labels of aliens to alien enemies with the declaration of war. And because Japanese were not allowed to become citizens, they immediately became alien enemies, which was an immigration status. Also in his files were his hearing or interrogation, a very long process in his case. Some people had only 5 pages of transcript, whereas his was 11. And you can see here that there were 3, the hearing boards were typically composed of 3 civilians and 1 military person. But after this very grueling interrogation, the hearing board basically recommended his release 3-1, with only 1 person recommending that he be interned. Nevertheless, he was sent to the immigration station in Honolulu, where his mugshot was taken, and he was sent to Sand Island internment camp. And it was there, while he was there, that the release order was basically countered by the order of the intelligence members, Naval Intelligence, Army Intelligence, and the FBI. And the interesting language is at the very bottom here, where you can see it says, it appearing necessary. But the use of the passive voice was very interesting. It appearing necessary, it is ordered that Tamasaku Watanabe be interned. But other key events, people, and documents in 2002 laid the groundwork for the project to evolve in other ways. One of the threads I identified is actually started at a meeting at the Smithsonian. It was a staff meeting where different people, volunteers at the museum were involved. And Marcia Mao, who was the grandniece of George Hoshida, was in the group. And she gave me a copy of this photo, this sketch that her grand uncle had done of my grandfather. So this was the second visual image that I had of my grandfather at all at that point. It was very exciting to get it, and I was later able to go to the Japanese American National Museum to find the original. Marcia also introduced me to a woman named Draco Odate Matsumoto, who was the daughter of a Buddhist priest from Kauai. And he was a very prolific writer of haiku, kept many journals, and was a member of the Literary Society of Santa Fe. Here he is in the upper right-hand corner. And the most important, I think, introduction that I received at this time was Reiko was in touch with an internee survivor, Reverend Shingetsu Akahoshi, and invited me to join her in visiting him in Virginia. This was in Virginia. And Reverend Akahoshi, in his 90s, remembered my grandfather and described an encounter he had with him in this way. Apparently, there was some kind of meeting, and someone was half drunk and threw a geta, or a wooden clog, at someone, he says, who happened to be sitting in front of me. I stood up and grabbed this guy's arm and escorted him to bed in his barracks. When I returned to the meeting, I assume, I was asked to appear at the office of the person in charge of the group. At that time, Watanabe-san was a witness and said, "You did a good job." This incident was described by Mr. Soga as an incident of pro-Japanese against pro-American sentiments in origin. But he, Reverend Akahoshi, says, "I knew that this was not so, and Mr. Watanabe knew that this was written up falsely by Mr. Soga." This ended up being the only in-person recollection of my grandfather, but I thought it was so significant because the man, after decades, still remembered it and remembered my grandfather. The second incident started with a talk I gave at the National Museum of American History on important research documents like this petition that I found in the National Archives. It was a request for a transfer back to Hawaii, signed by around 200 Hawaiʻi Issei, including Reverend Watanabe. Here's his signature down at the bottom here. I was circulating the document, there were no PowerPoints in 2002 that I knew of, and heard a commotion in the back of the room. It turned out that a young woman had found her great-great-grandfather's signature on this petition. This is her great-great-grandfather's signature, Kinai Ikuma. And I later learned that Reverend Ikuma, he was a Shinto priest, and that he was on the same transfer boat as my grandfather, who is over here in the same row on the other side. I met her, this woman's grandfather, in Honolulu at one point, and we had a very nice chat. He was in the 100th Battalion, and we spoke about his experience, his grandfather, the fact that his grandfather had been interned, but he didn't have a chance to visit him while he was interned. And yet he said something to me that has stayed with me all this time. He said, "You know, there's been a lot of attention paid to us veterans, the guys from the 100th and 442, but what about the old guys who were locked up in the camps?" These incidents reinforce the broader story for me. The hundreds of other Hawaiʻi Issei whose files were in the archival boxes with my grandfathers, and at the same time, the narrower story of the Hawaiian men sent to the mainland camps, treated by the government as a discrete group. When I arrived in Honolulu and the center in 2003, I was armed with this list that had names of not only the Issei, but their Nisei sons. That spring, at an exhibit at Hamilton Library celebrating the Nisei vets' 60th anniversary, put me in touch with Nisei veterans on this son's list. Like Bishop Fujitani here, as a young man, with his father. He had visited his father in Santa Fe. And I later discovered that his father was on the same transfer boat as my grandfather. Also, Akira Otani, who remembered his father being arrested at their Manoa home from this doorway. He also visited his father in Santa Fe, and others, of course. But from the Nisei, I learned about Issei internee survivors. Matsuda Sensei, Reverend Matsuda, Bishop Matsuda, was a Zen priest who had been arrested on the Big Island. He was the retired bishop at Soto Mission at the time. And he was a copious letter writer. He was a very avid letter writer and had many letters, both from that he had written as well as from his wife. Like this postcard, as well as letters that had been censored. But he also had this painting in his collection. And I was very happy that we could use this on the front cover of the book. There's also Mr. Matsumoto, who was a merchandise clerk serving plantations on Kauai when he was arrested. I went to visit him, I spent a couple of days with him, and he had brought back photos and artifacts that reflected his life in his internment years. He participated in the theater performances in the camp. Here he is playing the part of a woman, as was typical of Japanese theater, where men played women's roles. Here he is in plain clothes with his theater group. He also was interested in baseball, and apparently at Fort Missoula, where he was sent, the Hawaii group won a championship. But he also brought back artifacts such as these. He told me the story that he had learned to braid pine needles and then actually stitch them together into purses like this one. This top one is actually large enough to be a small briefcase, but this showed the importance of childhood skills. Nisei families also provided varying amounts of materials, like Mr. Kato's journal. Mr. Kato was also a very prolific writer. He kept a very detailed journal. of the early part of his internment, and then 167 letters that he had written back to his family, home to his family. These were translated by his wife and daughter, and I was able to read them all. He had a huge collection of photos, and I was able to actually find photos of my grandfather in the photos that he loaned, his daughter loaned me. This is a very important photo in that you can actually see the theater that they built, that the internees built in the background, but it represents the kind of services that they had for their compatriots. We gather that this is because of the robes of the ministers in the back, that this was a Tendikyo memorial service, and it was probably for Reverend Kinzaimon Odachi. Another very important story. I was able then to interview one of his daughters and included the story of his family in my book. There was also a scrapbook from Mr. Kawasaki. Again, he was accompanied my grandfather on the same transfer boat. Mr. Kawasaki was an attorney and kept a scrapbook with great detail, typewritten material, and records of his internment. And this was extremely important because he was able to record things in both English and Japanese. But especially these two documents, provided invaluable narrative links, which were absent in my grandfather's documents. And this was especially important because these two men, Mr. Kawasaki and Mr. Kato, were on the same transfer boat as my grandfather, and therefore in the same camps. So gathering all these documents and artifacts allowed me to develop some sense of the Hawaiʻi Issei's internment life recorded in the three in exile chapters in my book. Both their common and unique experiences as prisoners. And as I point out in chapter 9, how they asserted their will to manage their lives and maintain their integrity and dignity. That government list of sons in the US military that I showed you earlier inspired me to learn what units they served in. Here you can see the reference to the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service. And with my grandfather's notes, I was able to, I noted that there were internee sons who were killed in action. This led me to their stories, and I'd like to read you a short section about this. In a small pocket notebook spanning the period 1944 to 45, when he was elected as chief of his barrack and kept track of not only his own activities, but also daily events and news of his barrack mates, my grandfather noted on 4th August 1944, Kihachiro Hota, 21, killed in action July 10th. And the third son of Genichi Nagami is killed in action. The second son sustained serious injury. So from the government list that I showed you, I learned that Kihachiro Kyoji Hota was the father of Kihachiro, that Genichi Nagami lost his son Hiroshi in Italy 2 days later on 12th July 1944, leaving his second son Toshio badly wounded. And that my grandfather's friend, Teichiro Maehara, that his son Saburo was also killed in action a month before the end of the war in Europe. All three of these internees had two sons in the US military, but there were some who had 3 and 4 sons, I learned from this list. So to continue. In fact, of the 210 Hawaii internee sons in military service listed by the government, 7 had been killed in action as of 20th June 1945. Making this observation, realizing how the loss of the imprisoned fathers compounded the harsh irony of their imprisonment, I felt moved to learn and in some way to relate these stories in commemoration of the sacrifices of both the fathers and the sons. What the imprisoned fathers may not have known was when and where their sons died. Somehow, the losses of the fathers and the injustice of their imprisonment seemed to me most acute in those moments. I found varying amounts of information on these sons, but can share 2 stories briefly. Tech Sergeant Yukitaka, or Terry Mizutati, was the son of a Japanese school principal from the Big Island, who was on the same transfer boat as my grandfather. Here he is. Yukitaka himself was drafted before December 7th, then pulled out of the 100th Battalion to serve in the military intelligence service due to his Japanese language skills, then sent to the Pacific as a team leader. He was killed by a Japanese sniper on June 23rd, 1944, defending his command post against a night attack. He was awarded the Silver Star. Lieutenant Saburo Maehara was the son of one of my grandfather's barrack mates and was in the 100th 442, and the only internee son with his own family. The only internee son killed in action who had his own family. He had graduated from the University of Hawaii and was a beloved teacher on Maui, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the ROTC, so he was called back to service when the war broke out. He died on April 5th, 1945, on his 30th birthday, in one of the Nisei's most extraordinary battles of the war in Europe, referred to as the breach of the Gothic line. This was the last of the major German fortifications in Italy. The war in Europe ended a month later. The compilation of research on this chapter is in itself an interesting story, involving memories of family members, journalists, and those who served with them, as well as my own travel following the battle path of the 100th 442 in Italy and France in 2019. There are more stories on research from both inside and outside the barbed wire, and due to time limitations, I thought we could save this for another time. But I did want to mention that petitions and family documents also gave me insights into both Issei and Nisei advocacy. They showed that the stereotypes, any stereotypes of passivity were wrong. So I'd like to return to Santa Fe and questions of memory and vigilance. Mr. Silva's poem, "When the war is over and after we are gone, who will visit this lonely grave in the wild where my friend lies buried?" I think this raises questions of memory and collective memory and the importance of stories. And again, by a chance encounter, my research took on another dimension. I had returned to New Mexico for an academic conference in 2007 and met a young woman in the book exhibit, as happens at academic conferences. Lisa was an acquisitions editor for the University of New Mexico Press, and we chatted about my project. Her grandmother may remember the camp from her childhood, she said. And she said she would ask. Well, I made my pilgrimage to the Santa Fe Internment Camp marker, as has become my habit. And when I returned home, I found an email from her where she said her grandmother had been 8 or 9 years old, had been playing with friends near the Santa Fe train station, and saw Japanese men being brought in on the trains. They threw candy to the kids. And of course, during the war, candy was a pretty rare item. So she said she remembers this mainly because of the candy. But Lucy's memory inspired me to seek the stories of others in Santa Fe who were there at the same real time as my grandfather and his fellow prisoners. It was a strange verification of their reality in Santa Fe over 75 years previous. And I would like to, if we have time, I'd like to read a memory from this man, Rudolfo Rios, because I think it really tells us something about both memory and vigilance. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my dad would tell us about the prisoners that were on Casa Solana, which is where the subdivision is. We passed by to deliver a lot of wood further down. All of that was empty. We could see the high fences, and when it was warm, the men would be out sometimes without shirts. We'd pass by, and my dad would drive slow and try to explain as best he could to a child what was going on. I thought they had them in their gardening because they were gardening. Some of them were kneeling down and working with the dirt. And to me, they looked like children because they were smaller people. And I asked my dad, "What are they doing to those kids?" He said, "They're not kids, they're men." "You're young," you ask, "but what did the men do? What did they do?" My dad said, "They didn't do anything. The government picked them up because they're supposedly not Americans. They're afraid that they'll help Japan. Without even knowing, they just brought them here. When you're young, you don't expect your government to be doing this either. They hadn't done wrong, but since they were of another race, they brought them in without charging them with anything, herded them up like cattle and brought them here. My dad would try to explain that they're human beings just like us, but the war is against their nation." It was a sad time. After the Japanese left, we worked there. The lumber yard was delivering building material, and I was already in my 20s, 25, and the picture came back. The dirt was so rich right there. You could see why they were planting whatever they were planting, because the ground was black, rich, very rich. It comes back, it still does. When I pass through there, I tell my kids now, they had the Japanese Americans right there. They brought them they brought them in like cattle and put them in there. I can still see where the encampment was. I can see it mentally. What stayed in my mind most were the men working, and you'd see them from far away. I think remembering has to be coaxed, and events can serve as catalysts. So in the past few years, I've tried to work on such projects. And in 2012, and 2012, excuse me, we organized a 10th anniversary event for the Santa Fe Historical Marker. It was a 2-day symposium. And there have been projects sponsored by the National Park Service. The New Mexico JCL has had a several-year project called Confinement in the Land of Enchantment. And I'd like to make a plug for this last event, which is coming up in 2022. We're trying to organize a 20th anniversary event of the historical Santa Fe Internment Camp historical marker called Stories, Memories, and Legacies. So if you are interested, please get in touch with me and I can give you more information about it. I'd like to close with a paragraph, the closing paragraph in chapter 9. In the process of unbundling and rebundling these stories of the Hawaiʻi Issei exiled over more than a decade, what originated for me as a text-based study of language and literacy thus expanded into a multidimensional, multi-generational, multi-genre project composed of faces of young men and women now old, of fathers and grandfathers now gone, and of multi-ethnic voices speaking through oral and written histories in the present and material culture of the past. My personal family memory has become communal. My grandfather's individual life has melded into a community of lives, as the biography of one man has become a composite of the stories of many of the hundreds of men who, over the course of a sunny morning in December 1941, became alien enemies in their country of residence. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Gail. It's wonderful to see everything having come together. And you also got to the other end of the technical issues without it looked like a glitch. So I'm sure that's really gratifying as well, too. As I was saying earlier, we are open for questions or comments. If people would like to enter those into the chat area. We will finish at 1:15 to make sure that people can get on to their next class, even if that means actually just getting up, getting a coffee, and then sitting down in front of the computer again. But first of all, I'd just like to thank Gail for that presentation. As I'm saying, it's wonderful to see everything come together. What I would like to ask, just to get things started off, was along the way, it's clear looking through the presentation that you just did that you're dealing with all sorts of issues of material culture, text culture. How important to you in putting this together was drawing in on those materials other than just sort of documents? How important to you were sort of the photographs, were the bags, the weaving materials? How did you find they enhanced your ability to tell this story, or demanded to be part of the story?
Well, I think I like the word demanded, because really the documents were inert, but the the photos, even though they were one-dimensional, were certainly not inert. I mean, there was so much information in the photos, and of course in the material objects, you could actually feel and understand the depth of experience that went into something like those bags, for example, that Mr. Matsumoto was drawing upon a childhood experience, a skill he had learned in childhood, and was able to adapt it to the natural materials that were in his environment in Camp Livingston, Louisiana. And that I'm sure to some extent these things brought solace and comfort to the people who participate in making those kinds of things. I found it in other families that people had either learned from him, or that there had been classes or something where they learned to make these kinds of things. But I would say that if I can answer your question, I think the photos and the material objects spoke to me in many ways, partly because of my interest in material culture, spoke to me in ways that demanded that I examine them and that I integrate them into the story. I don't know if that gets at what you were asking.
Great. Just an editorial comment here. There is so much going on in life writing scholarship at the moment about the necessity of integrating material culture, images, photographs, that any kind of engagement with representation of a life has to recognize it's captured in different ways other than just straight written narrative. And I think your book reflects that and is part of that particular trend. We have a question from Jody Matos. Hi, Jody. We hear that this was something nobody talked about, but you found a lot of families whose relatives were interned with your grandfather. Did you find that they were interested in telling their story?
Yes, absolutely. When I gave talks, such as the one at the center, or at the Japanese Cultural Center, there were always people in the audience who may have had a family member or a friend who had been interned and would come forward with either photos or information so that I could follow up on that. So yes, I think this was an event that for some reason, many reasons, the Issei themselves didn't talk about very much. And families kind of had to bury this. But when there was more attention paid publicly, I think even in the case of artifacts, such as the one at the Hamilton Library, I put a small case together with my grandfather's artifacts. I think that triggered people to start thinking about their own experience or their relatives' experience, and inspired them to maybe dig out things that they had buried in a closet somewhere. So I think this was a story that wanted to be told by the families themselves, and some of them had, as I said, had many more documents. There were some who had almost nothing, but I was able to contact different kinds of people, and in some cases, I gave them some of the documents that I had gotten from the National Archives, so that they would have something in their collection as well.
Yeah, and Jody also offered a comment. There seems to be lots of documents on the incarceration of Hawaii Japanese and Japanese Americans during the war. This is definitely an area that needs to be examined further, and I'm looking forward to diving into your book, Gail. It is being examined further in all sorts of ways, partly under the impetus of Gail and a handful of other people who have been working on this extensively. And I can just offer personal confirmation that whenever Gail was giving one of these talks, and I was able to attend a number of them. I'm trying to figure out the right word. There were people that you knew would be there because they attended all of her talks. That it wasn't just a matter of once, but it was a matter of actually almost bearing witness to the fact that the story was being told again. So that Gail became a kind of magnet for almost periodic reunions of people, bringing new people in. And I know it was one of the challenges of doing the book to do justice to all the materials you were being offered and all the assistance you were being offered without producing a book that was going to be 4,000 pages long.
Right, especially when the press made me cut out some of the things that I wanted to include because of word count limitations. So I am very happy to talk later at some other point about some of the things that I had to cut out because I really would like to share, especially stories of the families who were amazing in their advocacy for their internee fathers.
Okay. Here's a question which I think is coming from Montana. We had a picture earlier of a successful baseball team there. This is from Julia Watson, who I will just mention to everyone here is one of the foremost autobiography theorists in the world. And knows Gail from seminars and various other things. And it's wonderful to see Julia online here. And as always, here's an astute and focused question. Hello, Gail and all. Thanks for a great and very informative presentation on your important project. I was struck by your remark that remembering has to be coaxed. Could you elaborate on ways that you learned to act as a coaxer and how your own sense of the complexities of memory might have changed in the process? And I will also add one correction here, which shows you how we're dependent on all sorts of things. I thought, Julia, I saw something that said that you had moved to Montana. But at the moment, she is in Columbus, Ohio, where she's an emeritus professor of comparative literature at The Ohio State University. Way you go, Gail.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if I can address Julia's comment very thoroughly, but I would say that coaxing, very often it's a matter of opportunity. And sometimes you create the opportunity, sometimes the opportunity comes to you and you are able to basically enhance whatever that opportunity is. But I think the process of remembering, yes, I believe my understanding of remembering has changed. I don't know if I can put that into words at this moment, but certainly I think the understanding of memory is something that's somewhat one-dimensional, that you remember something or you don't, especially as you get older. That is so much more complex, and it can be triggered by, as I said before, by events, by an object, by a smell. We know this, of course, just from any kind of memory studies, but what I learned when I interacted with different people, and you could see this in the comment made by Rudy Rios, that the depth of memory is unpredictable. And in his case, he was, I think he's probably in his 70s, but anyway, when I interviewed him, he was about 10 years younger, but he could remember the images of the camp itself. And in Lucy's case, she could remember the candy. It was the candy that helped her to remember the camp. So I think, we can talk about objects, we can talk about photos, we can talk about dreams, all kinds of things that can trigger memory. But I think it is sometimes up to us to serve as catalysts for that memory. And this is one reason why I have attempted, even in my later years, post-retirement life, to organize this event in Santa Fe next year. I'm hoping that we can pull this off in this time of COVID.
Okay. Jody has another, and by the way, what I will say here is we will keep this open for a while afterwards. We got a couple of questions here, but as I always do in these situations, if you need to leave at 1:15, thank you very much for being here. I'm sure Gail appreciates it as well too, but please feel no harm, no foul. Please feel perfectly free to log off. But if you would like to stay for a while, we'll deal with the other questions that have come up right now. Jody has another question here. Gail, could you talk about researching your book during and after September 11th? The parallels of ethnic racial profiling and civil rights controversies with Japanese Americans during World War II and Muslims during and after 9/11 are quite striking.
Yes. Well, I think the fact that I was writing my sabbatical proposal just as 9/11 was occurring, I can't remember if it was just before or just after. I think I had to submit it after 9/11 itself. But that certainly brought the import of my project home to me, in that we were seeing in front of just in the news the kind of racism and suspicion that was being imposed on Muslim Americans. And so that in itself helped me to put into some perspective what the incident that I was looking at actually, the seriousness of that incident. It wasn't just something back in history, but it was something that had an immediate relevance to the present. And then over these last 18 years, we've seen varying amounts of conflict and racial prejudice rearing its ugly head, in some cases more sustained than others. But certainly right now we're seeing a lot of anti-Asian racism again, having to do with the pandemic. So I think these events in the world help to shape not only our research, but how it affects us personally as researchers. Hopefully that answers a little bit of your question.
Okay, and this is from David Gustafson. Thank you so much for your talk, your book, and for the enormous amount of work this project clearly entailed. I'm curious if any of the people you talked to, especially Santa Fe locals, drew connections to the Manhattan Project, a very different relocation of immigrants to New Mexico. It's striking to me that the Santa Fe Internment Camp was so close to Los Alamos. I believe the two would be just out of sight from one another.
Well, yes, it was about 35 miles. Los Alamos was about 35 miles away from Santa Fe, although very much out of sight. But I think the irony, I don't know if there was any irony seen among the internees, because I doubt that they knew anything about what was going on, but certainly in a historical perspective, we can see the irony of the Manhattan Project being so close by. So I think that historians can certainly examine that fact and see what the conflicts could have been. One of the people who worked with me in the 10th anniversary celebration was actually a resident of Los Alamos, and her husband had been a scientist in the labs there. So, but we didn't talk about that too much. It was, at that time, it would somehow didn't seem as immediately relevant.
Okay. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, then, thank you all for attending. I hope we'll see you at future events. And Zoe Sproughton has put a number of the links. I urge you all to immediately go out and buy Gail's book. Support publishing and support Gail's project. And as I said, you'll be hearing about this from the center again in the future when we can really have the kind of book launch that it deserves. And we're getting thanks from Jody, from Kineka Hakuila, from a variety of people. And so thank you all. And I hope we will, quote, see you again soon.
And thank you so much for everyone for attending.